Sometimes we think that man is omnipotent, especially those who have connections in this world and a fat wallet. Sometimes it seems that there is no place on our planet where man has not set foot. But is it really so? And is it really always decided by money? Or is there something so terrible and unknown to man that you cannot escape from it, and not $1 million in your account will save you? This story is exactly about this. If you are ready, then let's get started. Behind the huge windows of the penthouse on the 78th floor, from where a panoramic view of New York opened up, the sunset was gradually burning out. The sky was filled with fiery red light, casting copper reflections on the impeccable parquet and sparkling in the glasses of expensive champagne that 6 people were holding in their hands. They were sitting in a spacious living room filled with the aromas of vanilla, sandalwood, and expensive tobacco, leisurely discussing the approaching trip. Adriana Lawson, dressed in an exquisite Chanel dress, slowly turned a thin rose gold bracelet on her wrist. Her hair, the color of ripe wheat, was perfectly styled, and her blue eyes looked with lazy boredom, as if she had long been tired of all the available entertainment in this world. "We deserve this rest," she said with a barely noticeable movement of her lips, taking a sip of champagne and smiling slightly. "All these endless social events and cameras. How tired I am." Opposite her sat Johnny Mason, a young man with a perfectly groomed beard, in a black shirt without a tie. Rings with large emeralds glittered on his fingers, and the look of his brown eyes was sharp and penetrating. "Tomorrow at this time we will already be flying over the ocean. This will be the best detox you could ever imagine," he said confidently, as if he knew in advance how exactly their trip would turn out. The Hoffman couple were sitting next to him. Clark Hoffman, a gray-haired man of about 55, in a formal Tom Ford suit, was leisurely smoking a cigar, listening to their conversations with a barely noticeable smile of superiority on his face. His wife, Jacqueline, an elegant brunette with a perfectly straight back and a pearl necklace around her neck, was looking out the window as if her thoughts were far away. "I can't remember the last time we had a vacation without servants and paparazzi," Jacqueline said calmly, not taking her eyes off the lights of the big city. "I think I've forgotten what silence sounds like." Simon Vega, a famous designer with unruly black hair and a cheeky smile, was pouring another bottle of champagne into glasses. He was a man of celebration. His charisma attracted people, and his sharp tongue could both make you laugh and hurt. "Guys, we're going to an island, not a monastery. At least pretend you're going to have fun," he said mockingly, causing the others to smile. Tessa Grant, the only one who clearly stood out among them, was dressed simply, almost modestly. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back into a careless bun, and her eyes studied each participant in the conversation. She always had a notebook in her bag, and she had already begun to mentally record the details of what was happening. This vacation was supposed to be her new story, perhaps the most vivid and sensational. "I am sure that something unusual awaits us," Tessa said, breaking her silence for the first time that evening. There was a mysterious confidence in her voice, as if she already knew that something was going to happen that they had not even guessed about. They did not know that an island was waiting for them, hiding secrets that should have been left buried under the thickness of time. They were too absorbed in themselves and their luxury to notice how the shadows were already beginning to thicken over their fate. The long-awaited day of the journey arrived. Our heroes' shiny, expensive cars were arriving one after another on the runway, bathed in the morning sun. Private jet number 66 was waiting for them, a sparkling Gulfstream with a perfect white skin, ready to take them far away from the boring bustle of the city. The heroes, chatting cheerfully, climbed on board, unaware of what was about to happen. The takeoff went smoothly, and the plane soon reached cruising altitude. The passengers enjoyed the view of the endless ocean, lazily discussing plans for the island. However, Tessa sat tensely, her gaze darting between the window and the phone screen, and her heart was beating faster than usual. She clearly felt something was wrong. Suddenly, the plane shook slightly, causing the passengers to exchange worried glances. A moment later, an alarm voice came from the cockpit. "We have problems with the instruments. Please remain seated and fasten your seat belts." A few more minutes, and the situation deteriorated dramatically. One after another, the engines began to fail. The plane shook with unprecedented force, and chaos and panic reigned in the cabin. The pilot reported that there should be no land in this part of the ocean, and gave the command to put on life jackets and prepare for an emergency landing on the water. But suddenly, an island appeared before the passengers' eyes, which simply could not be there. The pilot, not believing his own eyes, decided to land right on it. Pressed against their seats and clenching their fists until their knuckles turned white, the passengers met a violent collision with the ground. Part of the plane was literally torn apart. The tail section completely tore off, taking with it the lives of the crew members who were there. The heroes came to their senses among the twisted wreckage, bloody, frightened, realizing that their fight for life had only just begun. Chaos and silence alternated at the crash site. The island greeted them unfriendly. Gloomy silence, dampness, and dark jungles that seemed to be watching the uninvited guests. With difficulty getting out of the wreckage, the heroes trembled from the horror and pain they had experienced. Jacqueline cried, clinging to her husband's shoulder, and Clark quietly calmed her, stroking her hair. Tess took out the miraculously preserved first aid kit and took care of the wound on Adriana's hand, who bit her lips through tears, trying not to scream in pain. Johnny, with a broken phone screen, vainly caught the connection, cursing under his breath and desperately raising the smartphone higher and higher. The pilot, with a bloody forehead and a painful look, got out of the cockpit and reported with a heavy sigh, "No connection. The radio is destroyed. We've disappeared from radar, and they'll look for us, but it'll take time. In the meantime, we need to organize. We need to collect everything that's left whole and useful." Gathering around the damaged fuselage, they decided to split up. The pilot, Jacqueline, and Clark stayed by the plane, trying to organize the surviving things, water and food. The rest, Johnny, Adriana, Simon, and Tessa, went deep into the island to reconnoiter. The path through the jungle turned out to be a difficult test. Dense thickets, clinging vines, the buzzing of huge insects, and the rustling of snakes. All this made the heart clench with fear and disgust. Having fought their way through the impenetrable bushes, they suddenly found themselves at the edge of a shallow cliff. A strange landscape opened up before them. A rounded bridgehead, hidden under a veil of plants, with clear outlines of structures, surrounded by a high fence with barbed wire. There was something strange and disturbing about these ruins, as if they were alive and silently looking at the unexpected guests. "It looks like a base," Johnny said quietly, frowning as he looked around the place. Tessa, shaking, quickly made a few notes in her notebook. "Something clearly happened here. Something bad," she said, almost in a whisper. The sun was rapidly setting, the shadows were quickly lengthening, and the jungle around was filled with the frightening sounds of unknown creatures. Deciding to return to the find in the morning, they hurried back. Returning to the plane, the travelers, tired and silent, sat down by the fire, hastily preparing food and sharing what they had found. The strange place had placed anxiety in their hearts, but no one dared to express their fears out loud. Around the darkness of the night, distant and frightening sounds were heard that did not resemble any animal familiar to man. The heroes gradually fell asleep, overcome by fear and fatigue, not even suspecting that the night would bring with it not only rest, but also the beginning of a nightmare. A deep sleep had overtaken the travelers, confused, exhausted by worry and the long day. But in the middle of the night, a strange and ominous sound broke the silence of the island. A low growing buzz, like a distant howl. At first the sound seemed distant and barely audible, but gradually it came closer, surrounding them on all sides, as if invisible creatures were circling above the camp. Johnny and Adriana were the first to wake up, looking at each other anxiously in the gloom of the night. "Do you hear that?" Adriana asked nervously, sitting up and trying to make out something in the darkness. "Yes, it sounds terrible," Johnny whispered, peering tensely into the darkness. The sounds grew louder and sharper, cutting like millions of metal needles, crashing into their eardrums. The others were waking up. Jacqueline screamed and pressed herself against her husband, covering her ears with her hands. Tessa shuddered, dropping her notebook and looking around in fear. "What is this? What is happening?" Simon almost shouted, covering his ears with his hands. "I don't know," Clark answered, noticeably turning pale. "But it's definitely not the wind." Gusts of wind suddenly began to intensify, sharply lifting fallen leaves and almost blowing out the fire. The flames trembled and died down, leaving them in almost complete darkness, illuminated only by the dim, intermittent light of the moon. "It's not just the wind," Tessa whispered in fear. "It's something else." Enormous shadows seemed to glide over them, accompanied by the noise of wings flapping so powerfully that the ground shook. Panic seized everyone. They darted into the wreckage of the plane, trying to take refuge inside the twisted fuselage. "There's something out there. It's out there. It's watching us." Adriana almost screamed, trying to be heard over the deafening howl. "Quiet, please," Clark begged her, trying to keep his voice even, but his hands were shaking with fear. "We have to stick together," Johnny said firmly, trying to maintain the last of his composure. The nightmare lasted all night. The creature or creatures were clearly toying with them, as if studying their reactions, their fears, their weaknesses. They were trapped, helpless against an unknown threat, surrounded by impenetrable darkness. Only when the first rays of the sun touched the ground, the sounds disappeared as suddenly as they had appeared. There was absolute silence, as if nothing had happened during the night. The travelers slowly climbed out, looking at each other in shock, unable to comprehend what had happened. "It couldn't have been just a hallucination," Tessa whispered, collecting the things scattered on the ground. "No," Simon confirmed, his voice trembling. "We are not alone on this island." The pilot, looking exhausted and gloomy, decided to stay near the plane, continuing his hopeless attempts to find a connection or send a distress signal. The rest set off, resolutely heading toward the mysterious structures they had discovered the day before. They had to find out what was hidden behind the thickets and the fence with barbed wire, find out if there was anyone alive in this forgotten place, and understand what danger lurked in its shadow. Each step into the island was accompanied by a growing sense of fear and horror, as if they were entering the territory of something ancient and sinister. The jungle around them seemed alive, watching their every move, as if preparing to strike at any moment. And they moved forward, not yet knowing that the real darkness and horror were only waiting for their time. The travelers carefully approached the cliff, studying the slope in search of a safe descent. Carefully clinging to tree roots and protruding rocks, they slowly and tensely began to descend. Each step was difficult, but anxiety and curiosity moved them forward. Finally, having overcome the thicket, they found themselves in front of a high metal fence topped with barbed wire. Signs with the inscription in Russian "Forbidden Zone" and bright yellow signs warning about electricity inspired fear and bewilderment. "Do you think it's live?" Simon asked cautiously, stopping a few steps from the fence. "It's better not to check with your hands," Johnny answered ironically, looking around. "We need to throw something. Maybe we'll find some kind of animal or insect," Tessa suggested, examining the ground under her feet. A few minutes later, Adriana screamed when she saw a large beetle. Johnny quickly picked it up with a stick and carefully threw it onto the metal mesh. The beetle fell onto the fence and slowly crawled on. There was no voltage. "It looks like there's no electricity," Clark said cautiously, and plucking up his courage, resolutely grabbed the mesh. He exhaled with relief, making sure that there was no danger. Attempts to break or tear the mesh led to nothing. They moved along the fence in search of an entrance. After walking several dozen meters, the travelers suddenly stopped dead in their tracks. There was a huge hole in the fence, as if something incredibly powerful had simply torn it apart. "What could have done this?" Adriana asked in a whisper, pale with horror. "I don't want to know," Simon answered quietly, peering inside the forbidden territory. Having made up their minds, they carefully entered inside. The space was overgrown and long abandoned, in the middle of which towered a massive building, surrounded by strange, huge pipes, going up about 8 meters. The structures aroused anxious curiosity. Questions were growing, but there were still no answers. Coming closer, the heroes saw massive doors, next to which stood huge iron cages, covered in rust and entwined with plants. Adriana was seized by panic, but she forced herself to hold on. Together they picked up heavy metal bars and began to break down the doors. With great difficulty, the doors gave in, moving from their place with a creak and a crash. A corridor opened before them, filled with thick, musty air, saturated with moisture and dampness. Thick darkness met them inside, and only after turning on the flashlights, they decided to go further. Step by step, they moved along the gloomy and confusing corridors. In the light of the lanterns, inscriptions in Russian flashed, the meaning of which was incomprehensible, and the walls were covered with mold and strange stains, causing disgust and fear. Finally, their path led to the central room. A picture opened up before them that could freeze the blood in the veins. An old, hidden from prying eyes, Soviet laboratory. Tables covered with a layer of dust, broken glass, rusted devices and capsules in which experiments were once conducted. Something terrible had clearly happened here, and the heroes felt their hearts squeezed by a premonition of an approaching nightmare. "What were they doing here?" Tessa asked quietly, trembling all over. No one answered. Only a quiet rustling and distant grinding broke the dead silence of the laboratory, as if the place itself was watching them and waiting for its time. "We should split up," Johnny suggested, looking around the gloomy lab. "We need to find a source of electricity. There used to be lighting here." They went their separate ways, carefully stepping over scattered objects and trying not to touch the hanging cobwebs. Adriana, shaking off a thick layer of dust from another table, noticed a stack of old yellowed papers. "Guys!" she exclaimed excitedly. "I found something!" The others quickly approached her, carefully studying the find. The sheets of paper were covered in strange formulas, drawings, and incomprehensible Russian inscriptions. "Maybe one of you can make this out?" Adriana asked, looking at the others hopefully. "It looks like these are documents from the Cold War," Clark frowned, carefully looking at the date. It says 1962. It was a secret Soviet laboratory. They were developing biological weapons, Johnny said slowly, looking at the others. They were crossing human and bat genes to create the perfect soldiers. These creatures were weapons in themselves. There's an acronym here, IRKI. It seemed to be the name of the program, or these creatures. There was an uneasy silence that pressed on the chest, making it difficult to breathe. "Oh my God, what happened here?" Tessa whispered, feeling the blood run cold in her veins. Meanwhile, Simon, who had been studying the far corner of the room, called out loudly to them, "I found the panel. It's here." He lifted the heavy, rusty switch up. At first nothing happened, but then the lights began to flicker, flash and go out again, as if the electricity was struggling with long years of inactivity. Gradually the light stabilized, illuminating the room with an eerie yellowish glow. The picture that opened up before them made everyone shudder. Now they could clearly see huge cabins with tubes and beds with thick belts, reminiscent of hospital beds for patients in mental hospitals. However, the size of all the equipment was far from human. "Who or what could lie here?" Johnny whispered, barely holding back a shudder. "I'm not sure I want to know the answer," Tessa answered quietly, pressing herself against the wall. Ahead, they could see several dark corridors leading from the central room. Seized with anxiety, they nevertheless moved forward, peering into the semi-darkness of the passages. The corridors were narrow and gloomy, filled with a strange echo of footsteps and the whisper of drafts. Each new room that opened up before them was even more terrifying and mysterious than the previous one. Broken medical equipment, cages with broken locks, scattered instruments, and traces that could not be identified as human. Their hearts were filled with a primal fear of the unknown, and they understood that something terrible had happened here, and someone or something could very well still be hiding in the darkness, watching the uninvited guests. The travelers stepped carefully across the dusty floor and entered another room. Suddenly, a crunching sound was heard under Clark's feet, causing everyone to freeze. He slowly looked down and was horrified. A human skull lay under his foot. The women screamed and instinctively pressed themselves against each other, trying to overcome their fear. "Oh my God, what is this?" Jacqueline gasped, turning away and covering her eyes with her hand. "It seems there were people here," Clark said, trying to maintain his composure. They took a few steps forward and froze in shock. A mountain of human remains towered before them, long since decomposed and covered in a layer of years of dust. The horrific sight and the smell that permeated the air took their breath away. "Looks like a morgue," squeezed out Johnny, covering his nose with his sleeve. Perhaps these bodies belonged to those who did not survive the experiments. Unable to look at this terrible sight any longer, the heroes hurried to leave the room and moved further down the corridor. Soon an arched space with dozens of metal doors equipped with locks, reminiscent of the round wheels of old bomb shelters, opened in front of them. "What are we going to do?" asked Adriana, nervously looking around. "We need to look," Johnny said confidently. "We need to understand what happened here." After several attempts and considerable effort, they managed to open one of the doors. Inside was a huge room, with ceilings rising tens of meters high. In the middle of the room stood a massive table, littered with papers, old folders, instrument panels, and ancient computers. However, the hero's attention was immediately drawn to the cells, separated by heavy metal barriers. Directly opposite the table was the largest cage, in the center of which rose a concrete pedestal with massive chains and iron handcuffs. The dimensions of the structure were enormous. At least 10 people could fit between the handcuffs. Above the pedestal gaped a hole about 8 meters in diameter going far up. "So that's what those pipes were for outside," Simon said quietly, looking up in horror. "What kind of creature is this? How big could it be?" Tessa asked in a trembling voice. They quickly examined the neighboring rooms, and everywhere they found similar structures and terrifying traces of what had happened here. The heroes were so absorbed in what they saw that they completely lost track of time and did not notice how night had fallen. The world of horror and secrets of the laboratory completely took over their minds, and now they understood. Whatever this island was hiding, it was much more terrible than one could imagine. They stood in the depths of the gloomy room, looking at each other and trying to comprehend what they had seen. Suddenly, a muffled, alarming sound was heard in the distance. "Do you hear that?" Johnny asked tensely, peering into the darkness. The sound grew louder, getting closer and becoming more and more sharp and unpleasant. It was the same eerie noise that had haunted them at night, but now it seemed closer and more terrible, filling the entire space. The travelers frantically covered their ears with their palms, but suddenly they heard a sharp, heartbreaking screech, as if something huge was rapidly descending down the pipe, clinging to the metal walls with inhuman claws. The gusts of wind intensified, raising clouds of perennial dust and debris. The roar was so deafening, as if a concrete slab had fallen from a height. The travelers instinctively turned away, covering their faces with their hands. But when they looked forward again, horror paralyzed them. In front of them stood a gigantic creature, emitting a disgusting, eardrum-splitting sound. It was an urk, a monster, the embodiment of nightmares, a mixture of a man and a bat. Its sinewy, dried-out body was covered with grayish skin and the remains of fur. Enormous tattered wings spread out to the sides, an elongated muzzle with sunken eye sockets, and a massive fanged jaw was dripping with viscous saliva, and a long tail wriggled behind its back. It hung over them, towering several meters. It's that creature!" Adriana screamed, almost losing consciousness from horror. The monster roared deafeningly, shaking the walls of the room. The urk grabbed the cage with terrifying strength and began to tear it apart, trying to get to the prey. The travelers rushed out of the room in panic and tried to close the door with a heavy, round barrier. "Quickly, close it!" Clark screamed desperately. Having barely fixed the door, they heard with horror how the monster broke out of the cage and began to break out. Terrible blows, roars and rumbles echoed. "Do you hear? There are more of them!" Tessa screamed, listening to the sounds coming from the pipes. The urks, one after another, began to descend. "Damn, we left the other doors open!" Simon screamed. They rushed to the doors, feverishly closing them one by one, but one door jammed. The heroes threw themselves at it with all their might, but the door did not give in. "They're going to break through," Johnny screamed, seeing how the doors were covered with deep dents from the blows of the monsters. "We must run quickly," Jacqueline shouted, and the whole group, seized with panic, rushed down the long corridor, back to the central room. Behind them, a terrible roar, a wild roar, and the scraping of claws on metal grew. They ran, gasping with terror, feeling how death was literally breathing down their necks, and knowing that the nightmare had only just begun. They ran, trying not to look back, but the monstrous roar and rumble behind them was getting closer. The corridor was filled with terrible sounds, hissing and grinding of claws hitting metal and concrete. The urks, furious and hungry, crashed into each other, growling and fighting, trying to get to the prey first. The Hoffmans were the last to run. Suddenly Jacqueline tripped and fell to the floor with a scream. Her leg stuck in the rusty metal bars sticking out of the concrete. Clark immediately stopped, trying to help her free herself, but the bars wouldn't budge. "Help!" he screamed desperately, trying to pull the bars with his hands. The others turned around, but the Urks were already too close. "Forgive me," Johnny said barely audibly, looking at them with horror and despair in his eyes. The others hurried to hide behind the devices and tables of the central room, leaving the spouses alone with the approaching nightmare. Clark continued to pull his wife by the hand to no avail, despite her pleas to leave her and save himself. "I will not leave you," he shouted, grabbing a piece of metal and waving it at the advancing monsters. But it was too late. The largest Urk, of monstrous size, suddenly flew up to Clark and lifted him into the air with one paw. The man screamed in pain and horror when the monster tore his body in half, gnawing at his insides. Blood spurted in all directions, flooding the floor and walls. The rest of the Urks froze, watching as their leader dealt with the victim, greedily devouring the flesh and throwing pieces of the body to the sides. Jacqueline, seeing the painful death of her husband, began to scream, but her voice was drowned out by the terrible roar of the Urks. The main Urk, having had his fill, pointed at the woman with a bloody gesture, giving permission to the others. The Urks immediately pounced on her, pushing and biting each other, trying to be the first to sink their teeth into the warm flesh. The disgusting sounds of torn skin, breaking bones and chomping were heard when the creatures sucked out blood with monstrous greed and gnawed every bone. The remaining heroes, hiding behind shelters, could hardly contain their screams of horror and nausea, looking at what was happening. Johnny gestured to the corridor, indicating that they needed to leave here urgently. They quietly began to move toward the exit, carefully stepping over the scattered garbage and bloody stains on the floor. Tessa walked last, stepping carefully, but accidentally stepped on a piece of metal that made a sharp creak. The Urks immediately turned their heads and saw her. Roaring, the monsters, like giant bats, soared into the air and rushed towards her. The girl screamed in horror, but her screams instantly died down, drowned out by the sounds of torn flesh and the crack of breaking bones. The others, without looking back, rushed towards the exit, realizing that every second of delay could cost them their lives. There were 3 of them left. Frightened, exhausted, and almost without strength, they got out. There was catastrophically little time. Realizing that the monsters were about to break out, the heroes rushed to the huge door, leaning on it with all the weight of their bodies. In a panic, they grabbed huge metal bars, shoving them into the door handles, desperately hoping to buy at least a little time. From inside, they heard terrible, blood-curdling blows and the roar of the Urks, who seemed ready to tear the door to pieces. The travelers began to back away, barely keeping their feet from the horror that had seized them. "We need to run," Johnny shouted, looking around with a trembling voice. There was only darkness around. With only 2 dim flashlights left, they rushed forward, desperately hoping to hide in the dense undergrowth. Before they even reached the torn section of the fence, they suddenly stopped. A deathly silence suddenly reigned around. "Why is it so quiet?" Simon whispered barely audibly. "Is it really over? Maybe they've had their fill." Adriana asked hopefully. But a moment later, the eerie sounds of the Urks echoed across the island again. Suddenly Johnny cried out, remembering, "The pipes! They can get out through the pipes!" His words came too late. One after another, the hideous figures of the Urks began to fly out of the huge pipes. In the moonlight, their silhouettes seemed even more eerie and ominous. The flickering light of the moon reflected in their eyes, and their leathery wings made loud claps, as if night demons were rising from the underworld. The creatures were in no hurry to attack, slowly circling above the island, enjoying the panic and fear of their victims. The heroes rushed to run in despair, trying to hide in the impenetrable thickets. They fell, stumbled, got up again, and continued to run, not paying attention to pain and fatigue. The flashlights had long since fallen from their hands, plunging them into darkness. But the Urks easily saw the warmth of their victims' bodies and began to methodically snatch them from the thickets. The monster's claws clung to the bodies, throwing people up like toys. The air was filled with terrible screams and fountains of blood. The last girl, Adriana, running behind everyone, suddenly fell into a deep hole. With bated breath, she looked up and saw the Urks slowly circling above her, looking at her greedily. They came down closer, surrounded her, the vile slime from their mouths flowing straight onto her face. She screamed, but the scream immediately choked in her throat. The monsters snatched her body, instantly tore it apart, and began to greedily absorb flesh and blood, licking their claws and rough tongues. Having had their fill, the main Urk made a sharp, inviting sound. The Urks took off and rushed back to the pipes, disappearing into the depths of the old laboratory, away from the approaching dawn. The island again plunged into ominous silence, illuminated only by the first rays of the sun, indifferently illuminating the field of the last battle. With the first rays of the sun, silence fell, which seemed even more terrifying than the recent chaos. The Urks disappeared into the depths of the island, leaving behind only bloody traces and a frightening emptiness. The souls of the dead heroes remained forever locked on this cursed island, doomed to wander in fear and despair forever. Amidst the destroyed devices of the central room, hidden behind a thick layer of dust, a small button on the control panel glowed with a dim red light, which no one noticed in the panic. Maybe this was the last hope, or a way to put an end to the whole nightmare. But now it no longer mattered. Meanwhile, the pilot, who remained near the crashed plane, spent the whole night in a daze and horror, listening to distant, frightening sounds that echoed throughout the island. He did not know what exactly happened to the others, but the terrible screams and sounds testified to the worst. The pilot prayed quietly, closing his eyes and clutching a small cross hanging around his neck to his chest. When dawn painted the sky a pale pink, the pilot slowly climbed out of the wreckage of the plane. He stood in the middle of a deserted beach, looking at the silent jungle that hid something terrible and unknown. He understood that there was nowhere to wait for help. Hope was buried along with his comrades, but the fear of loneliness and the unknown made him step towards the thicket, to finally find out what had happened that night. Step by step, he moved forward, carefully listening to every rustle and crackle of branches. His heart was beating wildly, and his breathing was intermittent and uneven. The trees and bushes seemed to be watching him, ready at any moment to close in and swallow him forever. Having reached the torn fence, he stopped, peering into the depths of the territory, noticing with horror the bloody footprints and scattered pieces of clothing. He understood that his friends had met their painful death here, and cold sweat was running down his back. The pilot took another step forward, as if an unknown force was pushing him to meet his fate. Behind him, imperceptibly and quietly, that same button on the control panel suddenly flickered again, as if someone or something had reactivated the system. The red light slowly became brighter, and in the depths of the island where the pipes ended, a quiet but ominous sound was heard again. The pilot froze in place, realizing that the nightmare was not over yet, and perhaps was only just beginning. Is this the end? Do not forget that it depends only on you whether this story will get a second life. The one that gets the most likes and views will find its continuation with no less terrible and horrible development of events. Thank you for being with us.